14 months ago, my landlord slid a lease renewal under my door with the rent going up $340 a month, and I had $1,100 in checking. Not $1,100 saved. $1,100 total, 4 days before the next paycheck. I remember doing the math twice because I didn't believe the first answer. $340 a month is over $4,000 a year. On top of rent, that was already the biggest number on my budget, and I had nothing behind me if anything else went wrong at the same time. This wasn't the first time I'd tried to build a cushion. 2 years before that, I opened a savings account and moved $150 into it every payday. I kept that up for about 5 months, got to just over $700, and then I moved apartments and a move-out charge I hadn't budgeted for ate almost all of it in one afternoon. A year after that, I tried again after a small raise. I made it 3 months this time. Then a dental bill showed up that my insurance only partly covered, and the balance went from $600 back down to $80. Both times, I told myself the same thing. I'm just not a saver. Something about the way I handle money is broken, and other people must have some trick I don't have. That's not what turned out to be true. And I want to say up front what didn't fix it, because you've probably already been told all of it. It wasn't a side hustle. It wasn't a budgeting app. It wasn't cutting out coffee. And it definitely wasn't a raise. By the time I actually built the fund, my take-home pay was lower than it had been the month I started because of that same rent increase. 18 months after that lease renewal, on a smaller effective paycheck, I had just over $17,000 sitting in a separate account, and I hadn't touched it once for anything but its actual job. The difference wasn't willpower, and it wasn't income. It was that I finally understood what I was actually saving for, and stopped treating it like a regular savings goal. Here's the part nobody had explained to me before. Almost every piece of generic advice about emergency funds is written for somebody who owns their home. 3 to 6 months of expenses. Financial experts have said some version of that for decades, and it's not bad advice. It's just old advice, built for a version of renting that doesn't really exist anymore in a lot of cities. That number got popular back when a lease renewal was mostly a formality and rent moved a little every few years. Not a lot every 12 months. Nobody updated the guidance when the market underneath it changed. So millions of renters are still measuring themselves against a rule written for a slower, calmer version of the same word. The number stayed the same. What it's actually protecting against didn't. A homeowner's emergency fund and a renter's emergency fund are protecting against 2 different kinds of risk. And the standard number doesn't say that out loud. If you own a house, your monthly payment is mostly fixed. Your mortgage doesn't reset because a new tenant said they'd pay more. Your risk is concentrated. The roof, the furnace, the foundation. Big, specific, occasional. If you rent, your baseline cost itself is not fixed. It can move every 12 months, sometimes by hundreds of dollars. And you have no vote in that decision and almost no notice. On top of that, moving as a renter isn't free. A security deposit tied up in a unit you're leaving. A new deposit on the next one. A moving truck, new key fees. Sometimes a broker's fee that's a full month's rent by itself. A homeowner's emergency fund has to survive a leak. A renter's emergency fund has to survive the possibility of an entirely new address on short notice at a price they didn't set. I didn't understand that distinction the first 2 times I tried to save. So I was saving toward a number that was protecting me from the wrong thing. I had built a leak fund when what I actually needed was the building sold and the new owner isn't renewing anyone fund. There's a second angle to this that I didn't see until later, and it's about what a renter's emergency fund is competing against for the same paycheck. A homeowner building equity is, in a strange way, saving twice with one payment. Some of every mortgage check comes back to them eventually. Rent doesn't do that. Every dollar of rent is gone the moment it's paid, which means a renter's savings rate has to do all the protective work alone, with no equity quietly building in the background as a backup plan. That's not a reason to feel behind. It's a reason the target number has to be treated as more urgent, not less, because there's no second safety net sitting underneath it. There's a third angle, and it's the one that actually explains why a security deposit matters so much to this math. A deposit isn't spent. It's frozen. It still belongs to the renter, but it isn't liquid, and it isn't available the week an emergency actually happens. Most people count their deposit as part of their savings when they think about their financial cushion, the same way they might count equity in a home. It isn't. until a lease actually ends and the landlord signs off on the condition of the unit that money is functionally gone. And treating it as available cash is exactly the kind of quiet math error that made my first 2 attempts feel further along than they really were. Once I saw the actual risk, the mechanism I used was almost boring, and that's kind of the point. I split what used to be one savings goal into 2 accounts with 2 different jobs, and I automated both on the same day my paycheck landed, before I saw the number in checking. The first account was smaller and faster. 1 month of bare survival costs. Rent. Minimum debt payments. Groceries at the cheapest version of my normal grocery list. That one filled first, in about 7 weeks, because it was small enough to feel achievable, and finishing it fast gave me a reason to keep going instead of quitting in month 2 like I had before. The second account was the real target. 5 more months on top of that, sized not off my total spending, but off what I'd actually need if my income stopped and I had to be ready to move on someone else's timeline. Around the 5th month, I want to be honest about something, because most people leave this part out, and it's the part that actually built trust with myself. I had projected that by month 5 I'd have around $9,000, based on my transfer amount times the number of paychecks. When I actually checked the account, it was $7,140, not $9,000. I went back through the statements to find the gap, and it wasn't mysterious. It was a car registration renewal I'd forgotten was annual, and 1 month where I'd covered a friend's half of a trip deposit and told myself I'd pay it back into savings later and then didn't. Real numbers, real mistakes, about $1,900 off my own optimistic math. I didn't treat that as proof the plan was failing. I just rebuilt the projection off the real number instead of the hopeful one, moved my target completion out by about 5 weeks, and kept transferring. 2 months after that correction, the fund actually got tested, which is really the only way to know if any of this was real. My car's transmission started slipping on the highway, and the shop's estimate came in at $1,200. Money I did not have sitting anywhere else. I paid it out of the fund. The balance dropped by $1,200 overnight, and my first instinct, honestly, was to feel like I'd broken something, like 8 months of transfers had just been erased by one bad Tuesday. But that reaction was the old story talking, the one where any withdrawal meant the whole plan had failed. The fund did exactly the job it was built for. It absorbed $1,200 of bad luck without touching my rent, without a missed payment, without a credit card balance carried into next month at 20-something% interest. 3 paychecks later, the balance was back where it had been before the repair. The plan wasn't broken. It had just been used correctly. For the first time in my life. I also want to tell you about my friend, because her situation makes the mechanism clearer than mine does alone. We had almost identical numbers at the same point. Similar rent, similar income, both renting in the same expensive area, both starting the same month, within a few $100s of each other in take-home pay. She built her fund the way most generic advice describes it. 1 account, 6 months of total spending as one lump target, no split between fast survival money and the longer cushion. On paper, hers should have worked fine, but because the whole goal was one big distant number, the first few months felt like no progress at all. And by month 4, she'd stopped transferring twice and used part of what she'd saved for a plane ticket, telling herself she'd catch back up next month. She wasn't undisciplined, and she wasn't worse with money than I was. If anything, she'd always tracked her spending more carefully than I ever had. She was working toward a target that didn't give her any win to hold on to early, and a single account that didn't distinguish between money for a coffee maker breaking and money for losing her home on short notice. When her building actually did get sold 8 months later, and the new management raised her unit $200 a month, she had about $2,200 set aside, which covered less than half of what moving would have actually cost her. She ended up staying and absorbing the increase by cutting other things for a year. Same income, same rent, same starting line, same amount of effort by any honest measure. The difference wasn't motivation. It was that her plan didn't match the actual shape of a renter's risk, and mine, eventually, did. There's a reason this is harder to see if you're renting than if you're not, and it isn't about intelligence or effort. When you own a home, the risk is visible. You can point to the roof and picture the day it fails. When you rent, the risk is a piece of paper that hasn't been mailed to you yet. It's easy to treat rent as a fixed, boring number, the same way it was last year, because for 11 months out of 12, it behaves exactly like a fixed number. That's what makes it dangerous. you're not managing a bill. You're managing a bill that quietly reserves the right to change on you once a year. And most household budgets, mine included, for a long time, don't put a single dollar aside for that possibility until the letter is already under the door. There's also a quieter psychological trap in here, and I fell into it both times I failed. Every month the rent doesn't go up feels like evidence that it won't. That's not how any of this actually works. If anything, a market that stayed flat for a while is often a market that's due to catch up, but it doesn't feel that. Way sitting in a kitchen paying the same number for the 8th month in a row. Humans are bad at pricing in a risk that hasn't shown up yet, especially one where the absence of bad news gets quietly mistaken for a guarantee. A homeowner gets small reminders constantly, a strange noise from the water heater, a crack in the driveway. A renter mostly gets no reminders at all, right up until the one letter that changes everything, which is exactly why the fund has to exist before the letter arrives and not after it. If you're renting somewhere, the market moves fast. Here's the actual shift, not a spreadsheet trick. Stop pricing your emergency fund off your total monthly spending and start pricing it off two separate numbers. The smallest amount you'd need to survive one full month if income stopped tomorrow, and the amount you'd need to physically move and re-sign a lease somewhere else on short notice, deposits and all. Fund the first number fast, in its own account, so you get an early win instead of a 4-month wall of silence. Fund the second number slower, and don't touch it for anything that isn't actually a survival event or an involuntary move. The account structure matters more than it sounds like it should. Keeping both funds in the same place as everyday spending money is how a security deposit or a car repair quietly becomes available. In your head, even when it isn't supposed to be touched. I moved both accounts to a different bank than the one I do daily spending through. Specifically, so the balance wasn't sitting one tap away inside the same app I check every morning. That's not about willpower, either. It's about removing a decision I'd already proven twice I couldn't be trusted to make well in the moment. And when you check your progress and the number is smaller than your projection, don't take it as a verdict on your character. Recalculate off the real number and keep transferring. That single habit, checking honestly instead of quitting quietly, was the entire difference between the 2 times I failed and the 1 time it worked. The first 2 times, a gap between what I expected and what was actually in the account felt like proof I'd failed again, so I stopped looking. And stopping looking is how both of those attempts actually died. The 3rd time, the gap was just information. Information doesn't need forgiveness. It just needs a new number to work from. I had $1,100 and a history of failing at exactly this goal twice before. 18 months later, on a smaller paycheck than the one I started with, I had over $17,000 that had already absorbed one $1,200 transmission repair without touching a single other bill. The difference wasn't willpower, and it wasn't a better income. It was understanding what a renter is actually protecting against, splitting the goal so the first win came fast, and telling myself the truth every time the number came in lower than I'd hoped. That's the whole story. It isn't more complicated than that, and I think that's exactly why it finally worked.